Today I would go through what the Mamba architecture is all about. It's a architecture that, well, is built on a bunch of previous work, but seems to have come to the forefront in the last few months. So the paper released in December um, by Gu and Dao. Mamba, linear time sequence modeling with selective state spaces. So it's an interesting architecture that seems to be challenging somewhat the complete vice grip that Transformers has on language modeling. So it'll be interesting to look at. And we're also seeing this architecture kind of informing new hybrid architectures between Transformers and these Mamba or selective state space model architectures. So I'll kind of take you a walk through just the basics of it, and um, also how it's being used in other models. So yeah, so just to give an introduction about what it is. So yeah, it's an alternative class of sequence models, or model based on state space models, but in this case, as we see here, it's selective, and I'll try and explain a bit more about what this selection mechanism involves. Um, And yeah, one of the interesting things about this architecture is that it removes the quadratic bottleneck of the attention mechanism in transformers, while promising similar performance, scaling laws, and higher efficiency at long sequence length. So 1 million token plus uh, context. Obviously, there's been further work in the transformer area on getting around the quadratic bottleneck of the attention mechanism. Google have just released a paper with the infinite attention, which uses, interestingly, not the same mechanism that Mamba and SSMs use, but it's kind of similar in the way that it works. It uses kind of like a compressive, um, yeah, it compresses like the old KV cache into a kind of yeah into a memory space that then has linear attention over it, so it doesn't have this quadratic bottleneck. And so we're kind of seeing more and more of this type of thing, trying to get around this issue that's in transformers that makes inference much slower. Yeah, obviously this model, as it says here, is also faster because it doesn't have this issue of quadratic bottleneck. It's up to 5 times faster at inference time. Um, and as you can see here, so this is kind of like the scaling law of the model. So perplexity being kind of the metric that quantifies kind of how well the model predicts the next token in the sample text. Um, so it's like kind of a measure of how surprised the model is in a way of the text it's seeing. It's a commonly used metric in language models, and also uh, the flops. So like you can think of this kind of as like size of model as well, or compute required, which is normally defined by size of model. And you can see that it basically follows the transformer plus plus, which is using flash attention. So it has a very similar scaling law to that. So that's always obviously very good. It's improving in performance as it gets larger. Um, and yeah, so how they tested this was they basically, it's interesting, they tested it against rather small transformers at that time. I believe there's been further work testing this against larger transformers, but this initial work was just doing tests against, this Pythia 6.9b and 2.8b and kind of older GPT models. Interestingly, I'm not sure why they didn't choose Llama within this. It obviously makes this model look much better, but we do know that it does have good performance here. So it has, yeah, linear scaling and sequence length. Performance improves on real data up to million length sequences is what they tested. Um, and general sequence model backbone, so it achieves state-of-the-art performance across several modalities such as language, audio, and genomics. And on language model, their Mamba 3B model outperformed transformers of the similar size that they tested against. Although, as I say, there's kind of interesting choices there, so I'm not sure why. But it also matched or it beat essentially the Pythia 6.9b model, which is more than twice as big as the Mamba model, a transformer model. The Pythia model was. So yeah, I guess I found a quite nice article explaining about kind of breaking down how Mamba works and selective state space models, because they are quite complex, in my opinion. So this is kind of, these slides are just taken from there, a summary of that article that I recommend reading that's in the references of this deck. So the question is, like, is attention all you need, right? That's the premise upon which all transformers are built. So in the attention mechanism, you have the information from all previous tokens, which can be passed to the current token using the KV cache, so everything that's in the context window, which means in terms of time complexity, it has quadratic time complexity, and each new token generated takes linear time, which is the larger the context window, larger the latency, right? And in addition, the memory complexity of the KV cache is linear, so out of memory errors are a real issue. So that was kind of the motivation for Mamba in a way. Having said that, there has been a lot of research done into reducing these complexity issues in transformers. So, well, you could add more GPUs, but it doesn't help with training latency, increasing quadratically. And you can add, sliding window attention, which reduces the quadratic bottleneck. There's been flash attention, which uses very clever ways of moving the cache in and out of the two different forms of GPU memory, like from the faster to the slightly slower one, which is basically what all transformers use these days. And mixture of depths. So this is a new paper that just came out a few weeks ago. So it's selective token processing, basically. And also this paper called Row just came out about this. Basically, like, not all tokens are created equal, so why do we treat them as equal in the input? And you can lead to massive performance boosts in inference and training. And also the Infini attention paper that I just mentioned, which uses kind of like a compressive cache approach to storing all previous inputs. So it has, in essence, infinite attention. So there is work that's gone into this, but having said that, the motivation still stands. I think that, there are these issues that could be solved in different ways, not utilizing a transformer model. So, the two key components here that are key to both transformers and Mamba are the communication between tokens. So like Mamba here replaces the attention with the SSM model. You see here the communication between all of the input tokens, whereas we have kind of like this SSM model in Mamba, and then computation within tokens, whereas transformer uses, well, they both use MLPs actually, I should say here. So it's basically like this communication aspect is removing this attention mechanism, which removes the quadratic bottleneck. So as an introduction to state space models, there was a nice analogy to this using Temple Run, like if you ever played that game. Basically, the claim is, if you know the current state of the world and how the world is evolving, then you can use this to determine the direction to move. So say you only have the top of your screen as your next observation, it can be, and you don't have the bottom yet, you can derive this from previous observations by a model of the game mechanics, essentially, to give you your next movement within the game. So you can think of this as an analogy to prediction of tokens. So in this analogy, you have a hidden state. So H, in this case, you have an input observation and you have an output prediction. And H dash represents the derivative of the hidden state, i.e. how the world is evolving. So we can represent it as a differential equation because it's an evolution, essentially. And this allows us to determine the next move by learning system parameters C and D. So this is the very basic idea upon which this model is built. And I'll go on to expand upon this specifically in the case of Mamba and selective state space models. So if we think of the state in our model, in this case, the state refers to learnable parameters that we can combine with input variables that fully describe the future system behavior. So once we've successfully have the state defined, there's nothing more we need to know about the past to predict the future, right? So the system is basically converted to a Markov decision process, i.e. the future state depends only on the current state and the action taken, not on the sequences of events that preceded it, and therefore the state is a compression of the past, essentially. However, in the previous slide, you saw kind of the differential. Here we have we need to convert this continuous time differential equation into a discrete time difference equation. So Mamba uses something called zero order hold discretization, which is basically this set of equations, which you basically get a discretized version of the previous state space model. If you can recall from back here, where you have parameters C and D and your input. Yeah, and yeah, you basically have to learn these matrices. A and B become matrices, which you have to learn, and you have parameters that you have to learn in order to give your output. So if we look at this in the sense of the matrices here, basically, so similar to RNNs, interestingly, we have like an input X, which is combined with previous hidden state by some transform to give the new hidden state. So then we can use this hidden state to calculate the output at each time step, basically through kind of matrix multiplication as normal. We have to learn matrices here just as in any kind of model. So it's not that far removed from neural networks because it's just matrix multiplication at the end of the day, but it does, the method upon which it works is very specific to this kind of type of state space model where we're specifically learning these kind of state matrices, which are kind of a compression of the past. But obviously, I guess one of the things, obviously in like language or sequence modeling, there's a few specific requirements that we need to have as well. Like language, for example, is irregular. The input sizes are irregular, and we need to like have some connection across the input space as well. And yeah, it's kind of, like those are kind of requirements of the system that we have to have here as well. So if to concretize this, like what are actually these matrices, like A, B, C, D, right? So A is the transition state matrix. So you can think of this as the matrix of how you transition the current state into the next state, i.e. how should I forget the less relevant parts of the state over time? And B maps the new input into the state, like what part of the input should I remember? And C maps the state to the output. How can I use the state to make a good next prediction? And D is a kind of modified skip connection. So it's how the new input passes through to the output. How can I use the new input in my prediction? And here we have this like selective state space model. So you can see like all of these are kind of selective across time, right? They have a selection mechanism which chooses what to compress into the state space that we have. Kind of what's the most important parts of this input that we can compress into the state space that accurately predicts the output, or the next state, essentially, in our space. Yeah, so here we see kind of a nice comparison of effectiveness versus efficiency. So you can think of this as it's on two axes, efficiency versus effectiveness. And so you can think of the transformer network as being highly effective because it can look back at everything within its context window. And this is becoming obviously even more apparent now that we have even larger context windows like the needle in a haystack test, solving that over 1 million tokens, essentially, like to 99.9% accuracy. It can look back at everything. But the problem with that, obviously, is the efficiency of it. It can look back at everything, it's a double-edged sword here, right? Hence, the inference cost of that is large, especially in the current methods of quadratic complexity with attention mechanisms. But RNNs, to choose something that the state space models can kind of be compared to, is that they have low effectiveness because they can really only recall a small amount from their hidden state, and they discard a lot of information. But the benefit, obviously, is that their hidden state is small, so significantly more efficient than transformers. And Mamba has a nice combination of these two characteristics. It has a high to very high effectiveness because of its selectivity within its state space modeling. And it's as pretty much as efficient as RNNs. Obviously, we're looking at much bigger models these days than we used to, so slightly less efficient, but it has these nice properties of both of these systems. Yeah. So what's the selection mechanism here? Because it's a key part of selective state space models that Mamba is. So the selectivity, it transforms each token uniquely into the state, so we can improve upon the vanilla state space models, which apply the same matrices A and B to each input. So this gives Mamba basically like uniquely transforming each token in the input space rather than having these kind of like a homogeneous transformation over these A and B matrices. And these matrices are learned, these selective matrices are learned as a function of the input as well. So it provides the best of both worlds. You have selectiveness, obviously, about what's included in the state, like what really is the most important part of this input space in order to predict the next token, which gives high effectiveness, but it's also bounded because there's only so much memory, state space memory, essentially. So it means it's much higher efficiency versus the transformer. And yeah, just to come back to the effectiveness versus efficiency trade-off. So this is characterized by how well they compress the state in SSM. So efficient models must have a small state, while effective models must have a state that contains all necessary information from the context. So they proposed that a fundamental principle for building sequence models is selectivity, or the context-aware ability to focus on or filter out inputs into a sequential state. So in particular, the selection mechanism controls how this information is propagated into the sequence dimension and across into the state space. So again, if we think about this versus transformers, so transformers decide what to focus on at recall time, however. However, human memory systems decide what to throw away at memory making time. We don't have infinite recall and infinite attention across everything we see in everything we've ever seen or is within a current context, right? So if we had infinite memory, the transformer approach would be better than human recall, obviously, and it obviously is in many ways already. But if we had infinite memory, the transformer approach would be much better approach than deciding what to throw away at memory making time. But we don't have infinite memory. So the innovation of Mamba is allowing the model better ways of forgetting earlier through selectivity at memory making time. You can think of it in that kind of analogy. So this is quite again, quite a nice little analogy in this article, which is quite funny. If you think of it on the scale of a small state and a large state, you can think of traditional RNNs as like anarchic. So they have like a small minimized state, but the size of the state is bounded and they have very little resources. So it's like an anarchic state. Mamba has a compressed state. But it's selective about what goes in it. So Mamba is kind of like saying we can get away with a small state if the state is well focused on effective representation and how we selectively and dynamically compress this. So it's kind of like a compressed state. But transformers, the analogy here is that they're like a communist state. They have a maximally large state. It's just a cache of the entire history with no compression, essentially, and every context is treated equally until recall time. So I thought that was a funny little analogy. And then, yeah, this is just a comparison of information flow. So like in a transformer, the training data, information and statistics from the training data are baked into the weight in training. Mamba is the same. During training, we bake the information and statistics from the training data into the selective, into the state space model. But in context data is where we have this big difference between these two architecture types. So in the transformer, we have a high fidelity representation of past tokens. So often RAG is used to select additional context on top of that. Whereas in Mamba, we have the compressed representation of the past tokens into the state space memory. So that's really where the difference is. And one thing they mention that's interesting, another interesting point about how these models could be used is that instead of having like running the models, instead of having like different prompts, right? That you use, you could have different spaces. You could have a library of state spaces that has a model trained on specialized data. So they could be shared like LoRa kind of adaptive layers to models, which is much cheaper and faster than few shot prompting and fine tuning. So the structure of an effective LLM call goes from the system prompt, preamble, few shot question examples, and the question for transformers to simply like an inputted state with the problem context, initial instructions, for example, textbooks, and few shot examples, and then a short question for Mamba. So these would be like interchangeable state spaces between models, which I thought was quite interesting, kind of hot swappable model approach to this. It's quite cool. And just to get on to, so where are we seeing this really implemented now? So recently, this model came out called Jamba. There are models now appearing on Hugging Face as well that are pure Mamba models too. But I thought this model was very interesting because it's a hybrid model essentially. So what they showed, the authors showed there's well, that should be Jamba. The Jamba authors showed there's value in combining Mamba's long context with the transformer's high fidelity over short sequences. So, for example, for long videos, you could imagine having attention look at the most recent frames for short-term fluidity, and then the Mamba module for the long-term narrative consistency. So here's a nice comparison of, like transformer, you get the highest quality output, but Mamba, you get the highest throughput and the lowest memory footprint. And with Jamba, they've hybridized these models. So a Jamba block looks like a Mamba layer, and then a Mamba plus MOE, a bunch of those layers plus transformer layers in there as well. So you get the benefit of both of these approaches. And in a way, well, here's the performance as well before I go on to the next bit. Very good performance in general compared to like some pretty decent state-of-the-art models. You can see across a bunch of different tests they did, it achieves pretty state-of-the-art or almost state-of-the-art performance. And also the throughput is, significantly higher because of the benefits of this Mamba layer. The tokens per second are really phenomenal compared to even smaller transformer models at very large context windows. But one thing we have seen recently, as I mentioned at the beginning, is, well, Google, obviously not to be outdone ever, they always come up with something, and this is their kind of approach to dealing with the, both the quadratic complexity issue and also like having an infinite context window at high performance. So they introduced this new attention mechanism. Who knows if this is actually used in Gemini Pro? I'd be surprised if they gave it as part of the research paper, but some version of this might be. But it's basically like a hybrid attention, integrating compressive memory into the standard attention block. So it combines the local masked attention and long-term linear attention within this single transformer block. So it basically allows the transformer to handle infinitely long inputs with bounded and compressed memory, essentially. And it achieves state-of-the-art results on a 500K length book summarization task. So here, where we're talking about kind of local masked attention. So this is like focusing on the inputs that are close in sequence, so like the local attention, so short range dependencies within the data, and then you've got this long-term linear attention algorithm, so it's the long range dependencies, but it's compressed. So So you basically, it's also linear attention as well. So you don't have the quadratic bottleneck problem essentially. So these combined allow it to have effectively infinite um, attention, which is a pretty interesting approach. So I think we'll probably be seeing a lot more of this as well. But anyway, that is to say, these Mamba models, I think we'll probably be seeing a lot more of, and maybe in some sort of hybrid approaches going forward, because they just allow such massive throughput and very large context windows as well. So yeah, pretty interesting approach, I thought. Uh, Here's the references, so I'll post a link to this deck. But yeah, don't know if anyone has any questions. I'll try and ask them best I can. I don't consider myself like an expert in SSMs, to be honest, but yeah.
What kind of memory footprint reduction is there when using Jamba versus like say 70 billion?
I think if I recall correctly, the Jamba model, well, in terms of, let's see, Jamba model, I think in terms of the total parameters, I think it was, it was like, well, they say it's the only model of its size that can fit 140K context window on a single GPU. And I think I'm trying to find how many. Uh, it's 12 billion active parameters and an overall of 52 billion parameters because it uses a mixture of experts. And it supports 256K context length and can fit 100K, 140K tokens on a single 80 gig GPU. So it's pretty considerable, I'd say. I think there's a 7B. Yeah, there's a 7B model as well. I haven't actually tried it out yet. I need to test it on some things, but it's definitely an interesting model. Okay.
I guess one more
Cool.
question is
Well,
like,
yep.
how well can it handle like since a detention mechanism goes across the whole like um, whole sequence, right? Whole previous sequence, and
Hmm.
I guess the state space models using kind of like approximation of that, I guess.
Yeah.
I wonder how well can it handle like long-term dependencies, like if something has like a really beginning and you need to like kind of refer to that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. Trying to recall what their performance was on like needle in a haystack. But it does pretty well from what I recall. Maybe not as well. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have uh, that kind of um, unlimited recall in a way that like a full context window a transformer gives you. Um, but I think it does pretty well if I recall. I can't quite remember what it said in the paper. I'll try and find it. Needle in a haystack. Um, Here's right. I think you might hang on. I've still got you on my other window. Give me 1 second. I'll share this. So here's the needle in a haystack evaluation. So this is the ability to recall statements placed in the middle of context. So this is up to 256K token length. Full drops off a little bit in the highest um, context length. Context length, basically like input length. Um, but it's still, extremely good, I'd say. And I guess if you, well, I guess this is Jambas, yeah. Mm. So it's possible that, yeah, for example, we've now seen Gemini Pro with essentially perfect needle in a haystack evaluation across 1 million tokens, which is incredible. But again, that just goes to show, like, the benefits of the attention mechanism over this approach, this kind of compressive approach. So yeah, it's kind of, I guess you have to weigh up the benefits and the kind of the trade-offs of like the inference time and the the performance of this model compared to that. Yeah, they only used 4 attention layers and achieved this across 256K, which is pretty good, I'd say. Not perfect, but pretty good. So yeah, if you need like absolute recall, the transformer still beats it. And maybe someone's done more work on this, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, as I say, that's the trade-off essentially. Cool. All right. I guess I'll leave it there for today. I'll post the link to this deck. But yeah, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks,
Please, if you
Mike.
have anything,
Great presentation.
if you have anything you want
Thanks,
to
Mike.
discuss or like any topics or anything, either let me know or like if you're up for it yourself, go ahead and we'll put you in for the next one of the next session. Cool. Cheers, guys. See you later.
Thanks, guys. Bye.